You're sitting across the table from two people who both grew up in the same city, went to the same university, and landed jobs paying around $70,000 a year right out of school. Fast forward 25 years, and one of them is financially set, running an investment portfolio that generates more income every month than most people earn at work, while the other is still grinding, still stressed, still wondering why the numbers never seem to add up. Same starting point, completely different financial destinations. Sound familiar? Well, what if I told you the gap between those two people had almost nothing to do with salary, luck, or some secret investment tip they stumbled onto at a dinner party? What's actually separating them is a set of specific decisions, account structures, and psychological shifts that most Canadians never get told about. And I mean that literally. Nobody sits you down and explains this stuff. Not your bank, not your employer, not your high school. I spend way too much time thinking about why that is, and why the path to $1 million in Canada looks so different from what most people expect. Let's start with something that surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. The average Canadian household net worth crossed $1 million for the first time recently, sitting around $1,026,000 according to Statistics Canada. You'd think that sounds incredible, but here's the thing that should stop you cold. The vast majority of that wealth is sitting inside the walls of someone's house. We're talking about households where $900,000 is home equity, and the actual liquid savings, the money you can actually use and invest and deploy, amounts to maybe $100,000 or less. Financial researchers have started calling these people hidden millionaires. They hit the number, technically. But if you ask most Canadians what they actually need to retire comfortably, the answer, according to a 2026 BMO survey, is closer to $1.7 million. So the $1 million milestone that feels like the finish line is actually closer to the halfway point. And if most of your net worth is locked in a property you're still living in, you're going to need a completely different strategy to turn that into actual financial freedom. This is why understanding the difference between net worth and liquid wealth is one of the most important shifts in thinking you can make. Your house is valuable, but it doesn't pay your grocery bills when you're 68. Now here's where things get really interesting, and this is where most people's financial education completely falls apart. Canada gives you tools to build wealth that are genuinely extraordinary. Most people either don't use them at all or they use them wrong. The TFSA is probably the single most powerful wealth-building vehicle available to an average Canadian, and the majority of people treat it like a regular savings account earning 2% at their local bank. Let me show you how wild the math gets when you use it properly. If you've been eligible for a TFSA since it launched in 2009, your total contribution room by 2026 is $109,000. That's $109,000 that can grow completely tax-free. Every dividend, every capital gain, every dollar of appreciation, and you can withdraw it whenever you want without it touching your taxable income or clawing back your government benefits. Compare that to an account outside the TFSA where every dollar of interest income gets taxed at your full marginal rate, and suddenly you realize that the account itself is a wealth-building machine, not just the investments inside it. The RRSP adds another layer. Contribute to your RRSP in a high-income year, get an immediate tax deduction, let the money grow sheltered from the government, and then pull it out in retirement when your income is lower. The strategic move is to use both at the same time, maxing your RRSP when your income is high enough that the deduction is genuinely valuable, and letting your TFSA grow alongside it as your flexible, completely tax-free reserve. Most people pick one. The people building real wealth in this country are using both. But let's talk about real estate, because this is where the Canada-specific wealth picture gets genuinely fascinating. You probably know people who seem to have made a fortune without ever talking about the stock market, without ever mentioning mutual funds or index ETFs. They bought a house, then another house, then another, and somehow the numbers kept multiplying. Here's the mechanism behind that. The CRA gives every Canadian homeowner something called the principal residence exemption. It means that when you sell a home you've lived in as your primary residence, you pay zero capital gains tax on the profit. Zero. None. You could buy a property, live in it for 3 years, renovate it strategically, watch it appreciate, sell it for a $200,000 gain, and keep every dollar of that. Think about what that actually means compared to every other type of investment you own. Outside a registered account, capital gains get taxed at 50% inclusion, up to $250,000 in gains per year, meaning roughly half the gain gets added to your income and taxed at your marginal rate. With your principal residence, that inclusion rate drops to nothing. The effective tax rate is zero. Now, picture someone who's intentional about this. They buy a modest property, live in it, make smart renovations that genuinely add value, sell it tax-free after a few years, roll that capital into a slightly larger property, and repeat the cycle. Every 3 to 5 years they're capturing appreciation, paying zero tax on the gain, and compounding their equity in a way that outperforms almost any other after-tax investment strategy available to a middle-income Canadian. And they don't need to be a real estate genius. They just need to understand the rule and use it deliberately. The people who accidentally become millionaires through real estate stumble into this. The people who build real generational wealth through real estate do it on purpose. There's also something that most people building wealth in Canada never talk about publicly, and it's what happens when you own a business. The lifetime capital gains exemption is probably the most underused tax shelter in this country for people who qualify. Here's what it means in plain language. If you build a qualifying small business corporation and eventually sell it, the federal government lets you shelter up to $1.25 million in capital gains completely from income tax as of 2025. That's $1.25 million in profit that you could receive and owe essentially nothing on. For comparison, if you sold a stock portfolio and realized $1.25 million in gains outside your TFSA, you'd be looking at a very significant tax bill depending on your province. The business exemption changes the math completely, and it gets even more interesting. The government introduced a new Canadian entrepreneurs incentive that reduces the capital gains inclusion rate to 33% on up to $2 million in eligible gains, phasing in through 2029. Stack that on top of the LCGE, and a successful small business exit can generate life-changing wealth with a tax burden that would genuinely shock most salaried employees. Now, I'm not saying you should start a business purely for the tax treatment. That's a backwards way to think about it. But if you're already building something, if you're already putting in the work to create real value, understanding that the government has built a multi-million-dollar tax shelter specifically for Canadian entrepreneurs should absolutely influence how you structure that business and how you think about your exit strategy. Here's something that nobody warned me about when I started going deep on this stuff. Reaching $1 million in Canada, actually getting there in liquid investable wealth rather than just on paper, requires a specific sequence of psychological changes, not just financial decisions. There's a concept researchers call the security threshold, and it's the point where your brain stops treating money as a survival resource and starts treating it as an opportunity tool. For most people, the actual number that triggers this shift is somewhere around $50,000 in savings. Below that, every financial decision feels slightly desperate. Every risk feels like gambling with your survival. But once you cross that threshold and establish genuine financial stability, your relationship with money changes at a neurological level. Your cortisol drops. Your decision-making improves. you start thinking in years instead of weeks. And this is where the compounding really accelerates, not just in your investment accounts, but in your career, your business decisions, your relationships with money in general. The person who hits $50,000 in savings and keeps the same lifestyle, keeps the same expenses, keeps the same habits, and redirects every additional dollar toward income-producing assets is the person who reaches $500,000 next. Not because they got lucky, because they never fell into what I'd call the milestone trap, which is the completely natural but financially devastating tendency to upgrade your lifestyle every time your savings hit a new high. You see the number, you feel wealthy, and then you buy something to match how wealthy you feel. And just like that, you're back to square one with better furniture. The identity shift you need isn't about knowing more about investing. It's about genuinely becoming someone who finds more satisfaction in watching a portfolio grow than in spending the same money on things that fade. One more thing that doesn't get enough attention when people talk about becoming a millionaire in Canada. The tax drag on investment income outside registered accounts is enormous, and most people don't feel it happening until they look back and realize how much it cost them. Interest income from a savings account, a GIC, a bond fund, all of it gets taxed at your full marginal rate. In provinces like Ontario and Quebec, combined marginal rates at higher income levels can exceed 50%. That means half of every dollar you earn in interest gets taken before you can reinvest it. Canadian eligible dividends are treated better because of the dividend tax credit, and capital gains are better still because only half the gain is included in your income up to $250,000 annually. This is why the order of operations matters as much as the actual investments you pick. Max out the TFSA first, so your highest returning investments grow with zero tax friction. Use the RRSP for the tax deduction when your income is high enough to make it meaningful. And in taxable accounts outside registered vehicles, deliberately structure your holdings toward capital gains and Canadian dividends rather than interest income. These aren't complicated strategies. You don't need an expensive financial advisor to implement them. But the people who understand this sequencing and apply it consistently over 20 years will end up with substantially more money than someone who invests the same amounts in the wrong order, in the wrong accounts, paying taxes they didn't have to pay at every step. A 20-year-old who puts $330 a month into a tax-sheltered account earning 7% annually will reach over $1.26 million by 65. That same $330 a month in a taxable account at the same return, subject to tax drag at every distribution, will get you somewhere noticeably less than that. The difference isn't the investment, it's the container. And in Canada, you have access to some of the best containers in the world. Most people just never open them.